So sometimes research data is sensitive, not so much in my space, but we obviously want to keep the data because you want to be able to, come back to it in the future. So I work on the cloud. I pretty much have everything on OneDrive, so all my data is stored and backed up to OneDrive. If I need to share that data with someone, then I can simply share the folder link to OneDrive. We also do have some drives within our research team that have been set up specifically for data sharing, particularly for big data sets, so we can access those as a group. Storing your data on, your hard drive and not having a backup is a really bad idea. And I do know of students that have lost, data because of doing that, and it set them back months of work. Always having a backup, but mostly to the cloud, I think, is, that's where we're at the moment. Backing up, working on the cloud, keeping your data there is the most safest place.
First thing is making sure that whatever you promised in the ethics application, because you'd have thought through during the ethics application how you want to manage data, is followed. So one is whether it's anonymous, confidential, or who has access to data, and how you're going to protect data. These are the major questions that you have to be aware, and you have to be giving indications how we are going to do that. So where do you save? How do you password protect? And who gets access to that? And if it was an identifiable data, how do you make sure it becomes de-identified in the database? But then if it needs to be re-identified, where do you keep the identifiable data protected? So these are the key things of data management, but Australian government has regulations around it, and if it's a government funded project, how do you do that?
Data management is really important, and I should have said before, that's another thing that I really like about Nova, is that you can use it as a data repository as well. So a lot of journals now want you to have a link to your primary data that can be accessed by the readers or other researchers, and you can use Nova to do that. There's all kinds of other repositories you can use for that as well. In managing data, I think being systematic is really important, and having conventions for the ways that you name and store things. You don't want to be in a situation where you go, what did I call that very important file? So having a systematic approach to how you store things. It's also really important to have backups in multiple places, and making sure your backups are also in secure locations. So you obviously do not want to be in a situation where a computer dies or a hard drive dies, and you don't want to be in a situation where your data is compromised because you've stored it somewhere that isn't secure. So being organised with data storage, making sure that you always have raw data stored in an unedited form before you start doing any kind of data cleaning or data editing or data manipulation and analysis. Always having those raw untouched files that if anything does go wrong in the process, the cat walking across the keyboard while you're using your stats package, for example, that's happened more than once to me. Knowing that you can go back and retrieve that raw untouched data is really very important.
There's always a process where you transfer the data from when it's newly collected onto an electronic platform. So sometimes that happens automatically if your instrument is hooked up to a computer and it saves all the data as an Excel spreadsheet. But sometimes you're actually in the field and you've got a notebook and you're writing stuff down. So there's first of all, there's that, keeping the notebook. And so sometimes your supervisor or the lab that you're working for, if you're a postdoc, will actually ask you to leave that with them when you move on from that, if you're a student or a postdoc. And so in that case, you can photocopy it and keep a copy of it for yourself. I think that's a really excellent idea so that you don't lose it either. And you always want to keep a really good record of your methods in that case, if they're handwritten. If it's electronic, then you can back it up onto a shared folder that the other members of the lab have access to. So again, if you're a student who's exiting the lab and your supervisor may want to come back to that data, either to incorporate it into another piece of research or to try and publish it if it isn't already published, then it needs to be set out in a way that other people can understand it and that they know what you've done and they can find the data if they're interested in looking for it. If you receive funding from a particular source, you may be required to keep a copy of the data for a number of years after you've received that funding. And so again, you need to do that in a manner that it's not lost and that other people can follow it.
One of the biggest tips I have for managing data sets, particularly if you're a field scientist, is to take about 10 times more notes than you think you need to take when you're in the field, and make sure when you come back from the field that you write those notes up and you turn them into something coherent, because chances are you won't be analyzing your field data straight away. You'll be analyzing it several months or maybe even several years later, and you won't remember what you did in the field. And so those notes become the key to unlock what your data is telling you. So taking lots of videos, taking lots of images, photos on your phone even of what you did. Photos on your phone are great because they're typically time stamped and location stamped already. That you don't need to jot down those details. But something as simple as, if you take a photo of an instrument in the field, annotating on the photo just using the sort of like draw function on your phone in terms of scribbling with your finger what that instrument was can be so helpful later on.
The data in my research is really, I guess, non-traditional. Because I'm using a lot of archive-based materials, I've got a broad range of data, whether it's digitised maps, photographs, paintings, like colonial records, whether they're handwritten notes or digitised ones, but it's all material that has physicality in some way, so they're usually digitised. So finding ways to actually manage those has been quite a trick for me. So I basically just use a filing system on my OneDrive where I categorise things under different resources with headings that relate to the subject matter in them. So sometimes I will have material in replicated in several folders because they may relate to mapping, or they may relate to settlement, or they may relate to things, and they might be in different themes, but it is something that I struggle with because they're visual documents, but they might have several headings and I don't, or themes or topics that they work across. And so finding a way to make sure I can manage those and reference them but also find them again, I found a really, really big challenge. As my research includes a practice-based component, so there's an element of doing. So I might be looking at historical records or items in collections, and then I might be recreating them. So I actually produce physical items as part of my research, and so finding a way to store them appropriately so that they last for the duration of my research project is something that I need to come up with a method for and apply throughout, because something that I might make in my first year of research may become an important part 3 years on. So I've lent really heavily on the library's special collections team and getting, I guess, help and resources and best practice for conservation of items through them, and that's something that I'm using in my own research now. Yeah, and if it's not stored correctly, it can also just not only deteriorate, but it can actually just change the form. If it's not stored correctly and it's a woven item, it can collapse or it can just disform. So managing my physical items is part of, I guess, that managing my data, because in the end, those creative practices that I do become the data for my research.